welcome to part 2 of the introduction to the teachings. In part 1, we talked about the ideas of the teachings and a really brief summary about what the Way of Mastery says. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about how you might encounter and what you might find the teachings in the world. First of all, there are websites which provide all of the material in one place. One of them is called christmind.info. The other is the site for the channel JM, wayofmastery.com. So all 5 of the core texts are available for free, accessible online. If you want to have a physical copy of the books, there are 3 main different publishers that are publishing the Way of Mastery now. One is the Way of Mastery at wayofmastery.com. The other is the Shanti Cristo Foundation, and you'll hear a lot about the Shanti Cristo Foundation in the texts. It was the nonprofit set up to disseminate the teachings and also to safeguard and take care of the Temple Canyon land in New Mexico that's part of the Way of Mastery pathway. So, and there's another publisher, Audio Enlightenment, but the publisher Barry Peterson, who you may know, passed recently. So expect that publication strain will be eliminated eventually. But Barry's version of the Way of Mastery looks like this. You might see that. You might see that online. Barry also re-recorded all of the original audio teachings. So it's a little complicated, okay? But just bear with me. There are 5 core texts. There's the Jeshua letters, which is how it all started. Then a second book called The Way of the Servant. So those were first created as books. Then JM started channeling directly without the writing part being in between. And those channelings became a 3-part course, 12 lessons each. That was called, the first year of those lessons was called The Way of the Heart, second year The Way of Transformation, and the third year The Way of Knowing. Those were eventually turned into books, right? So we've got audio teachings and books. Now, all of the audio teachings, original audio teachings, are available at wayofmastery.com. But if you go to YouTube, you'll see all of them as well. But Barry re-recorded them all in his own, he's got a very good voice, and so he re-recorded them all. A lot of people, because he had huge reach in the spiritual community, know the Way of Mastery through Barry's recordings. So I'm just trying to cover all the ways you might first encounter the pathway and figure, well, what the heck's going on? So just to make it hopefully clear, we'll go through the 5 core teachings as they are published by various publishers. Barry publishes all 5 under separate headings. Again, the Jeshua letters, the Way of the Servant, the Way of the Way of the Heart, the Way of Transformation, the Way of Knowing. That's the 5 core texts. And then there's a bunch of other stuff called the Early Years. Just to make it much more confusing, the first time any of these things were published, the teachings were originally audios were published, which is kind of the heart of the core teachings of the Way of Mastery, the really, this is where the transformation occurs part. They were originally published in the early 2000s, for 10 years before they were published anywhere else, by the Shanti Cristo Foundation. So we've got, since Barry's not really publishing anymore, we've got the Shanti Cristo Foundation, a nonprofit originally set up to publish the teachings, and the channel himself are now publishing the materials. They're doing it differently because they have different opinions about the material. And like with any big spiritual teaching, they publish the Bible a lot of places, they publish the Course in Miracles a lot of places. People have different interpretations. It actually enriches the students' opportunities, I think. But just so you know, if I see this, that's one guy publishing it. If I see this, that's somebody else publishing the same material. And if I see this series, that's somebody else publishing the same material. With one exception, which is that the Shanti Cristo Foundation, who originally publishes the material, only publishes 3 of the 5 core texts. So the other thing that they do is they call the core texts, these are the course part of it, the Way of the Heart, Way of Transformation, Way of Knowing. As if this isn't all confusing enough, I hope it's going okay. But anyhow, they publish all of it and they call it the Way of Mastery, which it's only a small part of the Way of Mastery. It's only the three course parts. It doesn't include the Jesuit letters, doesn't include the Way of the Servant, and doesn't include the early years. But they call it the Way of Mastery, which is confusing. If it said, the Way of Mastery, just the 3 important course texts, then okay, that would make sense. But just so it's very confusing for people, and really very important, this is very important. The directions for when the course was given, when the material was given by Joshua, he said not to publish it under one book, in one book. Not to publish particularly, and Shiny Christo did not listen to this, not to publish the 3 core teachings, Way of the Heart, Way of Transformation, the course, Way of Knowing, 3-year course. Don't publish it under one book. So if you have this, I'm just saying this by way of studentship. It's very important to listen to Joshua when he says how to study it. He said, do not even read beyond the Way of the Heart. In the core trilogy, in the Way of the Heart, Way of Transformation, do not read the Way of Transformation, do not read the Way of Knowing before completing the entirety of the Way of the Heart. Not just reading it, but doing the course. And the course was designed 1 month at a time. So really sticking to the plan here, do the entire Way of the Heart over a 1-year period before even reading a word of the Way of Transformation or the Way of Knowing. It could be argued that a disservice has been done by the Shiny Krishna Foundation by publishing this book and not making that very clear to people and putting it under one cover so that people tend to read through. I've been horrified by hearing people will say, oh yeah, I did the Way of Mastery, and by that they mean they read this, which is like, that's going to make it almost impossible to benefit from the teachings. I'm just saying, as a 30-year student of the teachings, please don't just read through this book. If you want to just read material from the Way of Mastery, there's so much to read. There's the Jesuit letters, the Way of the Servant, and all the early years material, which can be listened to in its original audio online. You can read them in books and so on. So they were meant to be published under separate headings, under separate covers. Yeah, and now the channel has decided to do that and is publishing all of the material. Barry was doing it, but now JM is also doing it. And so here we go through, let's see, that's the Way of Knowing. We want the Jesuit letters first. So the 5 books. The first book, the Jesuit letters, which was the origins, the story of how Joshua appears to JM, and the earliest channelings, which act kind of as a holographic. It's amazing to read them because it lays out everything that would come 10, 20 years later. The second book that was published, The Way of the Servant, again, the Jesuit letters and The Way of the Servant were published as books, not audio channelings originally. The first 2 publications of The Way of Mastery back in the early 1990s. Then, for several years, the first group of students were given the audio recordings of the Way of the Heart for 1 year, the Way of Transformation for 1 year, the Way of Knowing for 1 year. Years later, they were transcribed, originally published by Shiny Christo under one cover, but then, one might say, properly published under 3 covers, the Way of the Heart, Way of Transformation, and the Way of Knowing. So in terms of proper studentship, I do recommend getting the books under the separate covers, just because it's the way it was designed to be done. So hopefully this hasn't been terribly confusing, but I wanted to give it an idea about how you might access this. And again, there's so much, like if you go type in Way of Mastery on YouTube, you'll get hundreds of different videos. You might see a video from me. You might see a video from, I'm a student, just sharing my experience as a student. You might see the videos, the original audio recordings from the Way of Mastery, who's a YouTube page. You might see the recordings that Barry made, re-recording in his deep voice, which had thousands of people followed that and found out about it first through Barry. He had a great voice, Barry had. So he re-recorded all the audio. So the material is available in lots of different ways. You might be saying, well, Dave, what the heck? What should I do? What I would recommend is either starting with, well, you can start online at wayofmastery.com or christmind.info. Those sites have all of the material. But if you like having books, I recommend starting with, I would probably start with the Jeshua letters, because that's the story of how it all starts. And then the second, get the book straight here. Then the other starting place I would recommend is The Way of the Heart, because it's the very beginning of the course. Also, I don't have the book here, but there's a whole series of books and audio recordings on the early years, which are about 25 subjects that were given independently. So there'd be an evening gathering. This is back in the 90s. There'd be an evening gathering after the Jeshua Letters was published. There'd be an evening gathering, and J.M. would go and he'd channel, and it was recorded. There are about 25 different topics, and they're brilliant. They're just so amazing. So while you're perhaps doing The Way of the Heart for the year and thinking, I wish I could read forward into something else, go ahead, read forward into all of the early years. Study the early years as a parallel to anything else you're studying. Study, I think, the Jeshua Letters or The Way of the Servant at any time during your progression through the 1 month at a time core teachings. I have a particular favorite, and this is what I recommend to start, particularly for people who've been Course in Miracles students, but one of the early years recordings, you can find it at christmind.info and probably at wayofmastery.com. And it's called Love Heals All Things. So in terms of an entry point, wherever you find yourself coming into the pathway, that'll be right, because there's a kind of a coordination that occurs, I believe. But The Way of the Heart is a great place to start. The Jeshua Letters, there we go. The Jeshua Letters is a good place to start, or really online at christmind.info or wayofmastery.com. And the early years recordings, which are just on individual topics, they're not like part of a progressive course. The early years just really give a beautiful flavor to the teachings and inform on subjects like, the feminine Christ and death and earth changes, Jeshua's predictions about what's happening in this time. Walk with Me, the story of his life and what happened, what his life was like, his own incarnation. Fascinating stuff. The death and earth changes message has really proven to be prophetic. And there are so many, joy, holy relationship, the feminine Christ, many, many other subjects again, this is the early years. So, quick final run through, and in the kind of the context that I would recommend it most, I'd probably recommend going for this series of books. If you're going to order some, they're available online, wayofmastery.com. And the sequence is the Jeshua Letters. The Way of the Servant is tricky because it's extremely esoteric. Maybe take a look at that after studying the other things for a while. And then starting with The Way of the Heart for the formal instruction. And do not buy or read either of these until you've actually completed the exercises of The Way of the Heart. So don't even think about buying The Way of Transformation for a year, and that's assuming you're starting The Way of the Heart study now. This is how the teachings are experienced. I suppose everything's perfect, but at the same time, I think it's worth respecting how Jeshua suggested students go about studentship in this. There's a wide range of ways you can find these teachings now. But if you like having a book like I do, these are the way to go. Again, thewayofmastery.com, and for seeing all the material, also christmind.info. This is David Chalk. Thanks for listening.